welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about health behavior and its different factors that we can think about in terms of understanding how people make decisions about how to behave and sometimes how they do it unconsciously. So first off, let's talk a little bit about the idea of whether or not we can actually change about health behavior. Well, we know that we can because we've seen changes over time historically in terms of things like how many people smoke cigarettes or how people treat alcohol or, rates of exercise, various different things. So you can look at historical trends, so you can see that there can be changes in behavior. We also know that you can see that on an individual level as well. That being said, sometimes it can actually be quite hard. The difficulty in terms of being able to do this can vary substantially. That being said, it is actually really important to think about this because what we know is that risk behaviors actually account for about half of all preventable deaths. So if we could actually effectively help people to change their health behaviors, well, that actually is a whole lot of people whose lives we could potentially save. All right. So how do you know whether a health behavior is going to be easy to change or hard to change? Well, one thing that we know is that health behaviors where you can very easily and conveniently substitute one behavior for another behavior are actually pretty easy to change. This is particularly a situation where you can change something with fairly equal value, but one behavior has much lower risk than another behavior. The example of this is the Back to Sleep campaign. All right. So this is the idea that if you take an infant and you have them sleep on their back, they're much less likely to get sudden infant death syndrome. So does a parent really care whether or not an infant sleeps on their stomach or sleeps on the back? No, not really. It's really easy to get them to switch over to another behavior because it doesn't really matter to them one way or the other, right? One can easily be substituted, behavior can easily be substituted for another. There's a few ways that you can help people to encourage them to actually adopt these new behaviors other than just saying that they're better. One is lowering the cost of a new behavior. So if you want people to start using LED lights instead of incandescent lights, well, lowering the cost of those lights can make a difference. So in Snohomish County, for example, they subsidize LED lights to encourage that behavior. Another thing is increasing availability. So some things you might want to do, but the more that it's available to you to take on that behavior, the easier it will be to just integrate it into your everyday routine. And then the other thing is that you can do is help make a new behavior easy to use. So think about making it less complicated for folks. So what are interventions that tend to be relatively hard? Well, interventions that have a major addictive or psychological component to it where people are really tied to doing a certain behavior, those are much harder to get them to change what they're doing. So when we're talking about things like drug addictions, there's a biological component to wanting to continue to do that thing. And it's actually pretty challenging to help people to change that, adjust that. Other things are when you have physical, social, or economic barriers. So it's all fine and good to tell people, well, you should be going to the gym and exercising more. But if people can't afford a gym fee, well, that doesn't help them too much, right? Or if there's some sort of physiological component, or your entire family really cares about eating fatty foods, well, it's hard to get people to change those behaviors in those situations. So for these hard addictive or high pressure situations where people, these behaviors are very ingrained, it can be very hard to get people to adjust. So very often interventions that try and get people to change these behaviors sometimes have success rates under 30%. unaided quitting of smoking, you only have about 5% of people who are able to do that without a patch or some other assistance in an intervention to get them to do that. So some things are incredibly hard to quit. So when we think about health behavior and health behavior change, there's a few different things that we can consider to help us to figure out how to approach this in an effective way. So historically in public health, we've had a lot of interventions that have been created to try and help people to change their behaviors. And very often they're done in a scattershot way, unfortunately, where people think, oh, well, I think this would be a good idea. We're just going to do this, right? Or we're going to do that. And there's no sort of real theoretical or conceptual framework behind deciding what approach they're going to take to help people to change that behavior. Well, in those situations, you have your inputs, your intervention, and you have your outputs, right? In terms of the health impact or the behavioral impact. And if you have an intervention that doesn't work, if you don't really have a conceptual framework for thinking about it, well, you don't really know why it didn't work, right? Or if you have an intervention that works great, but you don't really understand the different components to it, you didn't plan it out in a systematic way, well, then you also don't know why it works so well, all right? So what theories do is they provide a framework for thinking about systematically assessing an intervention to try and understand why it does work or why it doesn't work, okay? Now, in public health, we use a whole bunch of different types of theories to think about this. And they've actually been shown to be quite effective. If you use theory in designing your public health intervention, they've actually shown that you can be much more effective in terms of achieving a strong positive health outcome from your intervention. So if you're going to do something, you might as well do it right. And these theories can really help you with that. All right. So one of the very famous theories that sort of talks about, my first few theories I'm going to talk to you about are sort of the process of people going through change. And the first one of those, and the most well-known of them, is what's called the stages of change theory, right? Another term for this has been called the trans-theoretical model, all right? And the idea behind this essentially is that people go through a process as they decide whether or not to make a change. So you have what's called the pre-contemplation phase. During that time, people really aren't thinking about, they're not even considering making a change in their health behavior. Then something sort of triggers them to think, oh, I'm going to kind of think about this. Maybe this is something that I would consider. And they're sort of starting to engage with the idea of making a change in their health. Then we move on to the preparation phase, and that's where people are sort of saying, all right, maybe I should start planning for this. I think I'm going to quit smoking sometime soon, and that's the preparation phase. Then you have the action phase. That's where people are actively trying to actually make a change in how they're engaging with a health behavior. Then you reach a maintenance phase. Maintenance phase is when people actually switch from doing one behavior to doing another, all right? Now, ultimately, if you maintain yourself in that maintenance phase, then you go on to a stable lifestyle. You have actually changed from one thing to another. But there's also the possibility that you'll be doing something for really maintaining something for a while, and then you relapse. So say you're doing exercise and suddenly you hurt your back and you don't feel comfortable exercising, and then you never really get back to the gym. So then you have a relapse, and sometimes you can just forget about it. So you're not even contemplating going back and exercising again. So you can go back into that pre-contemplation phase. So this can be a cyclical process. In theory, the hope is that you move through those different stages, and you move from pre-contemplation to a stable change in lifestyle. But as we think about planning and addressing these interventions, we need to think about that as different strategies. Now, one thing to consider is that people are actually different, and you talk to them differently, and you engage with them differently when they're in those different stages. All right. So, as I'll talk about in a few seconds, When you're talking to somebody who's just in the contemplation phase, you might not want to be talking to them about the details of all the barriers and choices that they have to make in terms of this. You might want to be helping them to see the benefits, to see why the overall ideas behind why you might want to do this. Whereas when someone's actually already taking action, well, you don't need to convince them that they're doing something. If you just say to someone who's actually trying to smoke, you just keep on telling them why it's so important to smoke. Well, that's just annoying. They already know why it's important to stop smoking, right? What helps them is supportive type things and helping them with the process of continuing to take action and get into the maintenance phase, right? So you need to think a little bit about where a person is at as you're engaging with them. And if you judge people incorrectly in terms of their stage and you start treating them in the wrong way, well, it might backfire, and it might actually be not be helpful for them in terms of helping them to improve their health. All right, so what are some things that you can do at different stages in the stages of change model? Well, the pre-contemplation phase, where you haven't really thought about that, well, you can see whether or not people are ready to actually make a change. So there's certain circumstances where it actually may not be the best time to try and convince people to make a change. So for example, for smoking, I like using smoking. This model was actually created around smoking. So it's very helpful in those types of processes. So smoking, for example, I had a friend once who was, her job was at risk. She was had a lot of other stressors going on in her life, and it just wasn't the right time to add the additional stress of quitting smoking, right? So you think in those situations, maybe it's just not the right time to help somebody to make a change. Maybe it's better to delay that until next year or something like that. But when people seem to be ready, when it seems like something that they might be able to engage with and think about, well, then you can offer them some information to potentially help them. Once they're sort of thinking about this, they have information, they're thinking about it, well, then you've helped move them into the contemplation phase, right? And there you can really encourage them by saying a little bit about, why it might benefit them to quit smoking. It might help them to breathe more easily. It might, have social benefits as well. So, you don't want to scare people off at this phase. When you start getting really dramatic and scary, about how you're going to die or other things like that from smoking, well, that can actually turn people off and move them away from wanting to think about things. And you can also think a little bit about establishing where people are at that point. The preparation phase is where you can help people to sort of think about, okay, if you're going to engage with this, what do you have to do? How do you think about this? Here, it really helps people to sort of start creating these measurable goals, which are obtainable. When people start out, they think, I'm going to run 5 miles every day. Well, running 5 miles every day, when you're first starting exercising might not be the best thing. So thinking about what is a reasonable goal to have for a person who's just starting out with something is helpful. And also associating that with an actual timeline so that you can progress into this new behavior. You can also think about different interventions, so they can prepare to think about what is different ways that you could engage with this. So for smoking, one thing might be using a patch. Another thing might be thinking about, well, maybe I won't go out and stand with the smokers who are my friends. I'm going to engage with them in different ways so that I don't have that trigger to get me smoking. And that's also removing temptations, habitual temptations associated with an activity. Then you have the action phase. So that's where people are actually really doing it. Well, you can again focus in on benefits for this, but again, Here you're really thinking about what people are actually experiencing in terms of the benefits that they're seeing in their health. Encouraging them, supporting them, and making them feel like they're doing a good thing can also help as they're doing this. Here one thing that's helpful is sort of planning for the challenges that people experience as they're trying to make this happen. Thinking about these adverse effects and planning for them during that and dealing with them can help people to actually stay in that phase and stay motivated. We also know that some group and peer support efforts, counseling in various different forms, can be really helpful to sort of help people stay in that phase of continuing to work on that behavior. Now, then you reach the maintenance phase. So here's where people have sort of gotten into the new behavior. So they're actually maintaining that new behavior. So here you're wanting to continue doing this, continuing practicing those behaviors, keeping on engaging with them, and thinking about what can we do in terms of keeping this from not just being a temporary change, but maintaining this over time. So I gave you an example earlier of someone who hurts their back and then drops out of the maintenance phase. Well, you can think about, okay, how do you create a plan with somebody to make sure that they continue to do something even after they hurt their back? Well, maybe you make a plan that, you're going to give it a certain amount of time, but then you're going to have it on your schedule that you're actually going to get back doing things. Or maybe there's certain types of exercise that you can do to keep in the pattern of exercise that doesn't hurt your back, right? So thinking about those types of things. Now, there's one note that I want to make here in terms of thinking about these stages of change. I've talked a lot in terms of actual individuals who are going through these stages of change, and that's a helpful way of thinking about this. But it's also important to know that you can also think about at-risk groups or think about at a population level about stages of change. So there was a time when nobody ever used seatbelts, right? And that's meant that the whole society, the whole population was in the pre-contemplation phase in terms of use of seatbelts. So that's a situation where you think about, okay, well, we just need to raise awareness, right? So those stages of changes and the actions that you can apply not just to individuals, but they apply to groups who might be at risk for a certain thing, or are engaging the behavior at higher rates, or even whole populations, right? So it's a useful framework for thinking about this, for thinking about different strategies, and thinking about how you talk to a person at the right level as you're engaging with them. All right. Another theory that's helpful for thinking about the process of change in terms of health behavior change is called diffusion of innovation theory, which was created by Rogers. Now, what this theory does is it sort of thinks about how in a population there is a bell curve of people who adopt technologies or new innovations or new behaviors at different rates. So we have at the upper end of that curve, we have people who are called innovators. And these are a fairly small sliver of the population. Now, innovators are people who are really excited about new technologies. You all probably know one or two of them who they know about the new technology before anybody else. It's what they're about. They're about trying new things, being creative, always changing something or another. Okay, so those are the innovators in that theory. Then we also have the early adopters, and these tend to be the people who are the leaders in communities, and they're on the lookout for new possibilities. They might not be, that might be not be what they're about, but they want to be in that earlier phase. And then we have the early majority, and this is the group of people who tend to be more tech savvy, more capable of using new technologies, etc. Then we have the late majority, and these tend to be people who are just generally a little bit hesitant. They'll do things once they see everybody else doing it, but they, more or less, they want to see that everything is in place they kind of are getting pulled into doing it. All right, for that late majority. And then we have the group that's called the laggards. Laggards are people who just kind of skeptics. They just don't believe in new things and they don't want to change, right? Now, what we see is that across these different groups, there are certain characteristics. So innovators, early adopters tend to have really higher educational level, often have more resources to buy new technologies or use new things. They also tend to be younger, right? As you get into late majority and the laggard groups, so the laggard group, for example, tends to be people who are older. Very often older folks have a lot more difficulty engaging with new technologies. It's just frustrating to them. So for that group, you think about, for each of those different groups, you can think about how you want to, first off, which group you're going to be targeting, right? Whether you're just trying to get the early adopters to get engaged with the technology so that you can then start convincing the early majority to start using things because they see these leaders using it, right? Or maybe you have most of the whole population is using things, and you really want to target those people who are in the laggard group who are really struggling with doing this and really are skeptical about ever doing this ever, right? So really, it might involve going into their house and helping them use, whatever health technology, the new blood monitor technology that you want them to use. And that might require some handholding and some encouragement in those situations. And knowing a little bit about those populations and how they're different can be helpful in terms of thinking about this. The diffusion of innovation theory also has a couple sort of ways of understanding what factors influence whether people want to actually engage in a new technology. And a few things that you can look at here are things like relative advantage. So do people believe that the new technology has real advantages over whatever they were doing before, right? So if it's pretty much the same, it becomes a much harder argument to say you should really do this new thing if people don't believe that there's an advantage to adopting the new approach. Then there's compatibility. So how compatible is a new technology or new approach or new behavior with what people are already doing, right? So in the Back to Sleep campaign, it's very compatible because, you're always putting your child to sleep, whether you put a child to sleep on their stomach or on their back, doesn't matter, right? But compatibility for other things where you have to buy a whole bunch of new things, you have to change your whole workflow at work or, whatever you're doing, well, that becomes much harder, right? Another factor is complexity. So that's similar in the idea of how hard is this to learn? How much do people need to know? How complicated, how much mental energy does it take for people to do this new thing, this new behavior? And then there's trialability. How hard is it for somebody to just try out this new behavior, try out this new thing, right? So if you're just handing out sample packets of a new thing, this was created in the context of new technologies and new business opportunities. So an example of that would be trying out samples. That makes it a really low barrier to just trying a new cosmetic or something like that, or a new, cream, health cream, or whatever it happens to be, right? That's a very easy thing to try out, right? Whereas there's other things that maybe you have to invest a lot of time and energy and whatever to even try it. And then you have a big barrier to actually adopting a new behavior, okay? And then observability. How easy is it for you to see somebody else adopt a new behavior? Well, there's some things, health behaviors that we do, which are actually pretty private, right? So things that we do in doctor's offices or, for example, HIV screening, that tends to be pretty private. So people don't see that people are actually going and getting it. So a lot of the public education campaigns are to try and get people to publicly say, I'm doing this thing, so that people can see that their peers are doing this, right? And whereas there's other things that, you see everybody else at work doing it, so you're just going to do it. So the observability of a new thing makes a difference. All right. So let's go into a few different factors, overall factors in health behavior change models. So we're going to shift from models that sort of think about the stages of how people go through a change to the different factors that influence how people make a change. So here's just kind of a list of a few different things that we think about. So external or modifying factors. These are things that are traits of an individual that relate to how they, the communities that they're in, the social pressures that they are influenced by, their personal background and knowledge and other things like that, right? So these are contextual factors that influence how they engage with a behavior, all right? Then we have things, the perceived benefits, all right? So do people actually believe that if they engage with a new behavior, that it's actually going to have benefits for them, that they're actually going to gain something by doing this, all right? Then there's also perceived barriers. Perceived barriers are what people think are the things that will prevent them from engaging with this new health behavior, okay? So if the new health behavior is exercise, for example, well, a barrier might be, well, I don't have running shoes. Or a barrier might be, I really don't like getting sweaty. These are various different things that people see as being things that would prevent them from going to actually adopt a new behavior. Okay. Then you have perceived severity. So do people believe that the disease or the health outcome of not doing this is actually something that they need to worry about? Is there any concern about this being something that would be a problem for them if they were to get it? So if you think, so let's see, what's a good example of this? So people don't really think a lot about arthritis, but arthritis is actually incredibly debilitating, especially severe chronic arthritis can be incredibly debilitating disease, right? So there are certain diseases out there that actually are real risks, but we just don't really think about them as much because we're not aware of what those consequences are. So in those cases, the perceived severity might not be there. People might not recognize that that this is a dangerous condition, right? Then we have perceived susceptibility, all right? So it's one thing to believe that the disease is severe, but the second question is, do you believe that you can actually get that disease? So there's this idea of young people feeling like they're invulnerable, right? So they might very well believe that getting in a car accident is a severe thing to have happen, but they might believe that they're just really good drivers and therefore they would never get in a car accident. So the susceptibility, believing that this could actually affect you, is also a major component to how people think about behaviors and risk. So what are some other factors that we might consider? Well, another is perceived threat, right? Perceived threat is really fear, okay? This is the extent to which someone actually has taken their perspectives on a disease and it actually has resulted in emotional concern about that disease, all right? Then we have self-efficacy. Another term for that is perceived behavioral control. All right. So that's the extent to which people believe I can actually do something about this. I have a trust in myself that I can go and make this behavior change, right? Self-efficacy is actually really important. Of the various different factors that I've just told you about, it's been shown to be one of the most important ones to engage with, because there's a lot of things that you can do to help people build self-efficacy by helping train them how to do a behavior, for example, showing them like how to exercise, or showing them how to use their blood glucose monitor or things like that, making people confident in their ability to do something. Then you have another thing which is called response efficacy. This is a belief that if you actually make that behavior, if you make that change, that there will actually be a consequence for you, that you actually will benefit from it in some way. All right. That there is going to be effects based upon that change for you personally. And then another factor is social norms. Social norms can make a huge difference in terms of how people think about a behavior or factor. When you have all your friends smoking, well, is pretty powerful in terms of people's decision whether or not to smoke, because you're giving up, your social circle, going out and standing with your friends, as you take a break to smoke, right? That's a very ingrained social behavior. All right. So let's put some of these different ideas together in different models. Again, remember the theories are there to help you think about the process that people go through in terms of making decisions about changing behaviors. Okay. There's a model called the social cognitive theory. Now, the social cognitive theory is interesting, but it's actually a little bit more of a historical model. We don't use it too much anymore. But and the reason for this is that it's a circular model, or triangular in this case. What it's essentially saying is that if you influence either cognitive factors, things like knowledge, expectations, attitudes, or behavioral factors, things like skills, self-efficacy practice, or environmental factors like social norms, or influences from around you, from others, that influencing any of these things is going to influence all the other things, right? Now, the problem with this is that it's a little hard. If everything's influencing everything, it's hard to have like a direction to understand how things are influencing each other. So it's not a very clear method. But one of the really important things about this, and why people still talk about this model, is really that it presented the importance of self-efficacy. It was found in this model that self-efficacy is really important to influencing how people think about this. And this model is also pretty helpful for thinking about how social norms and social factors, by creating social structures, that you can actually change other things and encourage behavior change. Then we have the theory of planned behavior. So the theory of planned behavior, there's two theories, theory of planned behavior and the health belief model, which have been shown with research to actually be pretty effective. Some analyses I've seen suggest that both the theory of planned behavior and the health belief model tend to explain about 50%, about half of people's changes, half of the causation of people's changes in studies that demonstrate this. And that's actually pretty good. So the theory of planned behavior starts with the idea of we want people to change a health behavior. And what we want to consider here is intentions. So the belief here is that what people intend to do is a good proxy for what they will actually do. So in terms of understanding those intentions, well, there's a few different things that lead to those intentions. Well, one factor is their attitude towards the behavior, right? Another is subjective norms, which are ideas about how they think people think about this behavior. Another factor is perceived behavioral control, which is similar to self-efficacy, right? And it's the idea that I can actually make a change in that behavior. We actually see that self-efficacy actually goes directly to that health behavior as well, in terms of how this model is created. Now, each of those three components then are preceded by other factors. So attitudes towards the behavior are both beliefs about that behavior itself, and also evaluations of how effective that behavioral outcome will be in terms of making a change. Then we have the subjective norms, which are made up of normative beliefs, which is beliefs about what other people think about this behavior, and also motivation to comply. So there are certain circumstances, and I think this is an important lesson, where you might believe that everybody else thinks that you should do this, but you don't really care what they think. In those situations, well, subjective norms don't really make much of a difference. So, for example, I study a lot of things about genetic testing. Well, people might know what people think about genetic testing, or using that for, say, selective abortion, for example. They might know that their friends have lots of attitudes about that. But those are typically very personal decisions where they may not talk to their friends about it at all. They're making it in private with a clinician or with their partner or something like that. So in that case, the larger social expectations, they don't really matter, because you don't have any motivation to any motivation to comply because nobody's really going to know what you do one way or the other, right? Whereas there's other things which are very public health decisions, which then you might have a lot of pressure from your community, from social pressure to actually make that behavioral change or intend to do it at least. Then we also have the perceived behavioral control, right? So there's two components to this, and I think it's helpful to think about it in this structure. One is beliefs about how much it's possible to control a behavior. And then the second belief is the belief that you actually have the power to do those things. So you might believe, for example, that it's possible to start exercising or it's possible to quit smoking. You might have had friends who've done it. You know that it can be done, but you might just not have the confidence, the belief that you personally have the willpower, the ability to do this. And those two things combine together to create that perceived behavioral control, which is very important for behavioral intentions and for health behaviors. Now, all of those factors across the board are influenced by these external variables. And external variables are those modifying factors, environmental factors, things about a person's individual background that influence all those different things, right? Everybody comes from somewhere, and that's going to influence everything about how they respond to a different idea. All right, so that's a theory of planned behavior. Then we also have the extended parallel process model. All right, the extended parallel process model is, I think, a helpful model for thinking about how people make decisions that are emotionally laden. Okay, so the basic idea behind this is that there's when you have a message about a health condition that you want people to engage with, well, there's perceived efficacy, which we've already talked about, and the perceived threat, and the combination of efficacy and threat influences people's emotional response to this. And people can essentially take two different tracks in this, and these are called the parallel processes. All right. One track in this context is called protection motivation. All right. So that's where you say, oh, there's something going on here. There's this behavior. There's this threat. I'm going to deal with it. I'm going to protect myself, protect my health, and I'm going to make adaptive changes to control this potential danger to my body. All right. Then you also have another pathway that is mediated by fear. Okay. And there's certain circumstances in which people will engage in defensive processes. So instead of doing adaptive processes, you'll actually sort of say, oh, I don't really want to think about this. I don't want to deal with it. I'm just going to kind of ignore this problem that's going on. And that can result in maladaptive changes where people just move away from that behavior instead of dealing with it. And the reason that they do that is they're just trying to control their fear and get away from that fear. Okay. I like to show this in a different chart where you sort of see this idea that motivation on the y-axis and fear on the x-axis, motivation to engage in a health behavior can go up as fear increases to some extent. So when people don't see a threat to a disease, they're not really motivated to actually engage in that behavior, right? Why would you change if you're not actually concerned about that behavior, right? But there's also a tipping point at which fear can kind of actually inhibit your desire to engage in that behavior. And that's when you're sort of dipping into that defensive motivation, that fear track, where you actually avoid that behavior. So let me give you an example. So you all know that you have quizzes coming up. Have you thought about engaging the behavior of studying for those quizzes? Well, you might have thought about it. You might not have. But now that I'm talking about it, you're probably thinking, I'm actually kind of concerned about that a little bit. So what we see is that your fear, your concern is rising, and that probably is motivating you a little bit to say, all right, well, maybe I should start looking over my materials, thinking about my textbook, and engaging in this just so I'm ready for that quiz. All right. So what if I then start saying, well, this quiz is really important. It's a big part of your grade. If you don't do well, people are going to be concerned about your ability to do this. You might fail out. There's all these potential terrible consequences. You start talking about all the negative possible things that could possibly happen as a result of this. And what happens is your fear is just bumping up and up and up. And there's going to be a point at which you say, oh, I don't really want to think about this anymore, right? Instead of going home and studying, I kind of want to go home and watch a TV show, my favorite TV show. Or hell, I'll watch any TV show just so I don't have to think about studying or doing anything related to this, right? So that's that tipping point. That's when you move from being motivated to actually protect your health to saying, oh, I just really don't want to think about this. I don't want to do anything with this. I want to do anything to procrastinate or deal with this fear and anxiety that's been produced for me. All right. So I just give this example to sort of give us an intuitive understanding of this is how people think about health behaviors. This is how people engage with things like fear and those emotional responses. All right. One of my favorite models is the health belief model, as I mentioned, along with the theory plan behavior. This is actually a model that's used a lot and has been shown to actually be quite effective. So this model is kind of handy because it takes these different components and puts it together in a very sort of clear, or I think relatively clear track to understand how people make how people make changes. And the outcome in the case of this model is essentially the likelihood of taking action to change a health behavior. All right. So I'm going to sort of go through this in different stages. So the first box I'm going to talk about is perceived susceptibility to disease and perceived severity of disease, right? So again, that's the idea that you have to believe that you actually can be susceptible to that disease to actually care about that disease. And then you also have to believe that it's actually a problem if you get that disease to actually care about it. So really you need those two components, and those two factors interact with each other. And they interact with each other to create the next box as you follow that arrow, which is a perceived threat of the disease. All right. Now, above the perceived threat, so the perceived threat again is fear or concern that you actually would get that disease. So that's an emotional response to severity and susceptibility. Now, above perceived threat is those external modifying factors, things like your personality or knowledge or socioeconomic factors, right? And that can influence, the three boxes on the top, all right? Then on the bottom are cues to action. So there's certain circumstances where you might have these different factors, but you're just not motivated because you just aren't thinking about it, right? So it could be sometimes that, something comes up in the news, some famous celebrity has a disease, or, some family member really decides that they're going to push you to start making this health behavior change. And those are things that can actually motivate you to increasingly recognize that it's a concern and therefore increase your perceived threat, right? So overall, that perceived threat can lead to increases in the likelihood of taking action, all right? There's another box above, which is the perceived benefits minus the perceived barriers. So the idea of this box is that people think about do some calculations in their heads. It's not all emotion, fear type things. It's also a sort of calculation of, okay, what are the benefits of quitting smoking? Well, I might be healthier. I might live longer. I might be able to breathe better. Those different possible benefits. But then you start adding up what the barriers are. Barriers might be, I might lose my friend group. I really like smoking. It makes me feel good. It's a way that I deal with stress, right? So people in their heads go through a little bit of a calculation in terms of balancing those different factors out. And that also influences people's likelihood to take action. And then also you see their self-efficacy, which we've talked about before. How much does someone believe that they can actually do something, that they can make this change, that they have the knowledge and skills to actually do this thing that they need to do to make a change. All right. So all these different factors combine together to influence people's likelihood of taking action. Okay. All right. So I want to talk a little bit here about the idea of using these models. All right. So a lot of this I know sounds a little bit abstract, but how do you actually take this theory and use it in real life and in what you're doing? Well, what you can do is you can try and understand the different components that people are thinking about as they're addressing and considering this disease. So if you're talking to somebody and it seems like they really have a gap in terms of self-efficacy, they feel like they can't do it, well, maybe the intervention that you want to take is to help teach them how to do this. Or maybe, you're talking to teenagers about driving safely. Well, in that case, maybe what you need to do to make them recognize that this is important is to actually make them afraid of having an accident. You want them to actually believe that this is something that could actually really happen to them. So you're going to show, you might take a big crushed car from one of, a high schooler who died in an accident, put it out right in front of the high school, right? To just emphasize that this is something that's real. You're trying to help trigger that recognition that this is something that could actually happen to me. So by talking to people, by understanding the traits of people, you can actually think about how to engage with them to help them to increase their probability of changing this behavior. Now, sometimes it's not just individual people. Sometimes you're thinking about populations, you're thinking about groups. Again, this is public health. So then you might be thinking about teenagers as a whole in a school. And you might go and you might do a survey with them to say, all right, how do people think about their eating, right? How do they think about healthy eating? Well, the diagram that I show here is an actual study that was done with a bunch of people about how they think about eating behaviors. And what they saw, they could actually measure how much people thought about these different components and how influential they were on people's likelihood of actually changing their diets, right? So they could actually see, for this group of people, what are the most effective things to target to get them to change their behavior, okay? And that's why it takes some of the guesswork out of actually the idea of going forward with encouraging health behavior change. You're actually taking a scientific process, a systematic method to say, why does an intervention work or why does it not, right? So we can actually take it apart, consider the different pieces, and actually take a systematic approach to ensure that people change their health behavior. Because as we know, sometimes behaviors are relatively easy to change and sometimes they're very, very difficult. So the more tools that we have in our toolbox to address this, the better off we are to approach this in the future. All right. So that's an overview of health behavior, how we think about health behavior, and some of the tools that we have for addressing this to help people to actually engage with health behavior change. And as I mentioned at the beginning, health behavior is one of the biggest preventable causes of death. If we can do a good job of encouraging people to change those health behaviors, we can make a big difference in terms of mortality and morbidity in our society. So thanks for listening and take care.